And what worries me about that is that I am applying a degree of logic where perhaps it doesn't exist. So, I sometimes feel like I'm sort of retrospectively giving Trump's Truth Social tweets some kind of credence. The first mention of blockade, so while Vance was in talking and Trump did a whole series of tweets, there was one tweet which promoted an article that someone had written that said, Trump's next move should be a blockade.
Hi, I'm Harry and I'm a reporter for The Beacon, a new startup that covers the rise of populism in the UK and abroad. In our latest interview, we went back to speak to Commodore Simon Kelly about the US blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, how it will work, and what it means for the rest of us. Hi Simon, thanks for speaking to us again so quickly. Such a quick turnaround for the last time we spoke on the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, the situation's changed again.
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to say, just like all of these interviews, I'm going to say that we're recording this on the evening of the 13th of April because, it could change again by tomorrow. Obviously, we're now hearing of this blockade in the Strait of Hormuz that Trump's sort of outlined. And the UK has clearly stated that it will not be part of a blockade, but it said that it might send mine hunting ships to the region in an attempt to assist with the clearing of mines. Anyone who listened to our last podcast will know that your experience in the Gulf, but for those who maybe haven't, you spend a lot of time in the region, specifically in the role of, hunt clearance. So
yeah.
How will the UK work in this scenario if they do go? And what do you think, how will this blockade work? How's it going to work, basically, for people who don't understand? Because, I can't quite get my head around what this means and how it will be enacted in principle or in practice.
Yeah, so let's start with blockade. So it's interesting. So as we're recording, 24 hours ago, Trump was posting a sort of total blockade, and it was all shipping. And frankly, there's sort of the circles that the guys that I work with and chat with, and we've got, I've got a couple of really world-class legal experts on this. His position was illegal, but I think like quite a lot of what we see, there's a sort of initial communication in his style, and then overnight, Central Command, so the team that run operations in the US team that run operations in that region, shaped the sort of the communication of a blockade, and they'd obviously shaped it. They'd gone out. There's a couple of references in terms of the world-class references in terms of the legal definitions of blockade. And when you read the CENTCOM release overnight, words like the language of it put it back into a place where if you squinted, you can see that it's legal. And I say squinted because we're in a place where we sort of shift on a daily basis from what is legal and what is not legal. And all of it will be poured over in years to come. And obviously the truth is whatever you make of it that day, and certainly from Trump's view. So blockade. So what we're likely to see, I think, and there've been sort of various views on it, is the US have imposed this blockade all along the coast and all along all Iranian ports, but they're not going to sit inside the Gulf and sort of sit off the harbour in a sort of, I guess, like Nelson would have done in his day off a French port. What they're much more likely to do is gather as much information as they can. They're going to sit with all of the airborne assets that they've got looking over the Gulf, all sucking in all the data and all the information they've got about everything that's moving off the coast and in and out of the port. And they know what they're looking for in terms of the shipping. They're looking for the big stuff. They're looking for the VLCCs, and it's fairly obvious where they're coming from because they're coming from the sort of main oil depots, refineries and things. And they'll be able to see them tracking out along into the Straits of Hormuz. And of course, there's very little traffic going through there. And so it's quite easy to pick them out, even if they're not shining, they're not emitting on AIS, they're sort of their automated information system. I think that's what AIS is. One of these acronyms that you use and then you forget what the actual words were. So that pushes out what kind of contact they are. And so they can see them coming out. And they don't need to go and get them. They can just wait for them to come out because as the strait opens up into sort of reverse funnel, they can just position ahead of them and they can conduct some kind of interdiction. And that interdiction will either just be VHF warnings and they'll tell them to reroute, I mean, we'll come on to what happens if they reroute them or if they board them in a moment. Or alternatively, they'll send US Marines on board by helo, small teams, sort of 10 to 15 US Marines. They'll fly on. These guys are not going to have force protection. And so it is a very easy situation then for them to then sort of take control of and board. And they'll do all this outside of the range of certainly Iranian craft coming out from the coastline. That they're not likely to interdict them. And they've done this before. This is what they were doing in Venezuela at the turn of the year. And they sort of successfully blockaded Venezuela. But it was sort of it was under slightly different rules and regulations, and the legal position was contested anyway. So they seized the vessel, or they divert it to an area that they wish to divert it to. And this is one of the big unknowns: is what do they do then?
Yeah.
If they were to say this, they seize a tanker with 2 million barrels of oil in it, whatever it is, and they decide that what they're going to do is divert it. The question is, where do they divert it to? Because if they want to go to an anchorage in Omani or UAE territorial waters, they're going to need their permission to do that. How do they hold them? What do they do? Do they take the oil and sell it on the open market? That's what they did in Venezuela, but they had they just established a legal requirement to do that, or a legal basis to do that through Congress. And so they're able to do that, but there's nothing in place at the moment. So it's really difficult to understand what this blockade will look like.
I know the Gulf states. I mean, we spoke about it briefly in our last interview, but are the Gulf states going to want to be? They're going to want to be hosting these tankers that the US have seized. I mean, surely that just puts a target on their back, right?
I can't see it. There's sort of I've almost been sort of pondering. As I was thinking about it and as I've been discussing it, I've said that they won't send small craft all the way out there, because we talked about this before, that, the Iranian Navy has been decimated. And so they don't have anything that can project out sort of into the open sea anymore. That's gone. Or it would go very quickly if something appeared off the coast. The Americans would strike it straight away. That'd be easy. But would they, if there was some kind of boarding or an approach to one of these vessels, would the Iranians risk firing at the Americans to prevent it? Long range strike using drones and things like that. I mean, you're as likely to hit your own tanker, or you're more likely to hit your own tanker than you are to hit the Americans. So I can't see that as being a thing. And so the Americans seize it. Would the Omanis and the UAE host this? I don't know. I haven't seen any nation overwhelmingly support this. I mean, we've seen what Starmer has said. Starmer has outright rejected it and has called for opening of the straits and free transit, which is what needs to be returned to the end state. It doesn't feel like something the Omanis would be comfortable with, because they sort of they try and sit in the middle of anything and maintain good relations with all their partners. You're right. It just involving yourself in something that doesn't feel legal, doesn't feel like something that any of the GCC would be willing to do at this stage.
Do you think this will entail US warships in the Strait? Or do you still think they'll hold back from that?
No.
Because no.
I don't think they would fix themselves like that. I think they'll be, they could be 100 miles out of the Strait, just sitting waiting for them. Right. And they'll judge where the sweet spot is for them. But given that the Iranians, I wouldn't put any of our, US warships anywhere where those kind of shorter range missiles and drones. So they've been sitting quite nicely out of the Straits of Hormuz. If necessary, they can sprint in, do an interdiction, done, back off. So they're never going to want to hem themselves in where they could be caught by the Iranians with drones and short range missiles. So they'll do it all at range. They'll keep it all at arm's length. I mean, they might confound me and those of us who are looking at this and do something really challenging, but I don't think so. We move on to the mine hunting.
Yeah, because I was going to say, what's the point in those going to the region? Yeah, where do they sit in this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, again, since you and I last spoke, we had the peace talks announced, and then almost straight off the back of that, the Iranian, I think they call the Port and Maritime Organization, pushed out a recommended route through the Straits of Hormuz, and they put this big hazard area over the sort of center of the Strait of Hormuz and almost overlapping into sort of into Oman. And they said it's a hazardous area. There could be mines. And we've seen reporting that, Trump said himself, oh, they've laid mines, but they don't know where they put them. Well, that may be true. They may have just kicked them off the back of a boat and not recorded where they are. But even if you knew where they are, you're not going to make life simple for anyone and tell them where you are, because then you just go and recover them. And they're not going to want to do that. They're going to want to leave that area. They've just created the perfect block, because the classic line is you don't need to lay a mine, you just need to say you've laid a mine, and that has the effect of a minefield in itself. And we're seeing that right now. And I was on an interview earlier today, and I was asked a question about mines, and I talked through mine clearance. And the other person on the interview was an energy expert, and I talked about conducting mine clearance operations. And her final point back was, well, it doesn't matter whether you do this or not. It's about whether the merchant community believe that it's safe or not. And that's the point. While there's a doubt, you freeze the movement through that central route in and out of the Gulf. And everything is got to route up and over via sort of Larak Island, and puts it right into this sort of Iranian toll booth concept. So what would you do? So really interesting. They sent the USS Michael Murphy and USS Frank E. Peterson. So these are two cruiser destroyers, absolutely high-end fighting warships, destroyers, through the strait and back again. I think that's interesting, because I think that indicates the Americans were confident there were no mines there. Because we put ships in off the Falklands as sort of like almost one-shot minesweepers, as in frigates off the Falklands in '82, to kind of drive up and down to prove there were no mines there. It's a terrifying prospect. So they must have had huge levels of confidence there were no mines where they were going to go. So they put these ships in, and straight away you can say, right, they've done that route. There's a center line. We can now say there aren't any mines there, and it starts to build confidence. What they'll then do, and they won't be doing this now because they won't be doing it under the threat of the Iranian missiles and small craft, is what they'll want to do is we've moved away now from ships with sonars attached to the ship that go into the minefield and sort of hunt the seabed, look at the seabed with a sonar. It's like kind of like going through on the seabed with a torch and sort of like torching your lamplight through the seabed on the seabed. What we do now is we've got underwater autonomous vehicles. So you've got these things. They're like massive. They're like big torpedoes. If you imagine they're sort of put together in sections, there's a battery. Unsurprising, it's sort of tech you would imagine them using on oil rigs and things like that. There's a battery section, there's a navigation section, and there's a sonar section, in simple terms. And this sonar looks down at the seabed, and it can paint an incredibly detailed picture of what is on the seabed. The Americans have the littoral combat ship that they have sort of generated as these sort of, the expression is, it's a ship without a mission, and mine warfare is a mission without a ship. So these ships are not well adapted, they're not well equipped, and they're not well trained for it. Their own mine warfare experts, the US Navy's mine warfare experts, have said that it's just not up to the task. And they've said that publicly. So ideally, you put them on a craft that's got some kind of a crane or some kind of a launch mechanism. You put these things to the water. They'll go out, just conduct their mission up and down and up and down, and over time they will clear a corridor, and you'll get this high definition picture of what's on the seabed, and they'll try and clear a channel wide enough for a merchant vessel to use. If they find anything, the simplest thing is actually to choose a route where there isn't anything. But if they do find anything, the challenge is then you've then got to send something else in to attack the mine that's on the seabed or floating beneath the surface. So there's sort of like, the challenge we've got is we haven't quite tied all the bits together. A mine hunter was brilliant. Crew 45, 50 meters in length. You'd send it out and it would do everything from detection all the way through to neutralization, where you shoot the mine or you send a diver down with explosives on it. And it could do every phase of it. What we've now got is we've got incredibly capable systems that can go off autonomously but we haven't really got to the stage where all of that is linked together to, okay, you found something, you've now got to get something else in, and you've got to shoot the mine. That's
Yeah.
quite complicated underwater when you're in the middle of the Straits of Hormuz, as you can imagine. So what they'll do, I'm expecting them to go in and find nothing, which is what that's the
Right.
best thing.
So, in terms of the actual blockade, then,
Yeah.
I mean, does this work? Does this work for the US? Does this get them any closer to their goal, whatever that is? I mean, I still don't think anyone knows what that is, but does this work for them? Because you listen to, you've heard Keir Starmer and Macron talk about this, 40-nation alliance is going to go in and negotiate for the opening of the strait, and like you said, the purpose is to open the strait up again, and freedom of navigation, etc. And it also, I was listening to something the other day, and it said, it's a dangerous precedent because it is an international waterway, and if the Iranians are going to charge for it, then technically, then that opens a whole other can of worms, right? But so
Yeah.
this blockade, does this work? Does this get anyone closer to? And also, surely this is an escalation, right? This is not
Yeah.
de-escalating. This is not reducing tensions.
Yeah. So I'll start with that bit first. Blockade as a doctrinal technique is an act of war. So what they are doing is in every sense breaching the conditions of the ceasefire, and it is escalation. However, they're doing it in such a manner that they're sort of almost, if you sort of squinted it and don't look at it too closely, it doesn't feel like escalation the same way as firing a missile. But yeah, by the rules that govern armed conflict, that is an escalation. It's a breach of the ceasefire. So you're quite right. And it could lead to an escalation as well. I mean, that's the thing. It's these sort of unintended consequences. And we've seen this at every stage.
Well, that's what I was going to say, yeah.
Or
it's like, surely you're putting things more in the way of you're basically, you're not like goading or tempting, but you're bringing things to the boil in a way that there's a higher chance that something happens, something that's more obvious to people that is an escalation or that is an act of war, or that's how.
Yeah. I have reflected certainly over the last, I guess, 24, 48 hours as we've looked at certainly this blockade. And I find myself sort of weaving what I would say is the sort of strategic thinking that underpins this. And what worries me about that is that I am applying a degree of logic where perhaps it doesn't exist. So, I sometimes feel like I'm sort of retrospectively giving Trump's, Truth Social tweets some kind of credence. The first mention of blockade. So while Vance was in talking and Trump did a whole series of tweets, there was one tweet which promoted an article that someone had written that said, Trump's next move should be a, and you kind of, there is part of me that wonders whether what happens is he sort of goes into the war room, whatever his team is, and he says, well, I've read this article and they said blockade. And of course it works in Venezuela. So why, can we do this now? At which point, he's there to challenge him when he sort of gets an idea in his head. So could it work? I don't know. I think there is some logic to it. So what does it do? It puts a stranglehold around the main source of income for the Iranians, so that the oil has remained on the market for them. Ironically, I mean, this is the thing that sort of makes me think I'm sort of retrospectively creating justifications. Of course, at the start of this conflict, Trump lifted sanctions on Iran so that they could sell more to drop the price of oil. And now we find ourselves in a position where he's trying to choke it off. There's a contradiction there. But so I think the first thing is that he chokes off the oil, and if that is the bargaining chip in terms of that revenue, and the second thing is if he's able to break Iran's control over the Straits of Hormuz, if he's able to sort of break their use of the toll booth concept, because that's one of the things I'm waiting to see is, okay, he said they're gonna board and conduct a blockade on everyone who goes through from an Iranian port. What happens if you are going through and you go via the toll booth and you may or may not pay $2 million to the IRGC in Chinese yuan through an intermediary to the IRGC? Well, that puts you in contravention of US law in terms of support to foreign terrorist organizations. So as you go through, are you going to be boarded because you have just broken French, American regulations on foreign terrorist organizations, or is it if you're not, so there's a whole load of things that need to be answered. So he chokes it off in terms of, because it's the same sort of thing as seizing Carg Island. If you put a stranglehold on their income, does that break them? And does breaking their leverage over the Straits of Hormuz in this toll booth apply the same sort of pressure, like reversing the chokehold that the Iranians have got over the Straits of Hormuz in a sort of, I don't know, some kind of weird kind of jiu-jitsu, judo style kind of reversal. I, it
Because I was
feels
going
a
to
bit
ask,
like
right?
logic in hindsight.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that obviously, JD Vance went to Pakistan for these negotiations. There's been a lot of talk about how that was a disaster, and he was sort of mocked for that, especially after he also, his appearance at the Orban rally, and then Orban lost the election. It's like JD Vance hasn't had a very good week.
No,
There's also this talk of like Trump always chickens out, that whole like taco Trump always
thing,
chickens out. Like he makes a claim and then he sort of backs down from it. I'm not saying the blockade is a threat. One of these ideas, like you mentioned, that he sort of, he has at 2 o'clock in the morning and tweets about it, and then it comes into fruition, because clearly, we're at the point where this has been pushed a bit further than that. This isn't just an idea.
yeah,
This
I
isn't
think
just
this is
talk.
further
It's
than that.
being,
Yeah.
it's being pushed out by maritime organizations, and people are like, like there's an organization to it that would suggest it's a bit more than that. We've been through the fact that it's an escalation, but we've spoke previously about like off ramps for the US administration, right? Ways that they can just sort of get out of this conflict now. And we were sort of speculating last time about whether or not there are ways for them to get out. This doesn't look like that. This doesn't look like an off ramp, right? This just creates another situation for them that they're gonna, because if they put this blockade in place, they're the ones that are gonna have to police it, right?
Yeah,
And
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 yeah,
so
and it feels like a game of chicken, or like a staring contest to see who's going to blink first. And the Iranians
it
have an
does.
amazing resilience. And how long can they last without that oil revenue? I don't know. They're a nation who've managed to survive. I mean, sanctions regimes that last longer than I can even remember. So they've survived that for a very long time. It's part of their culture to survive under pressure like that. Whereas
Mm.
it feels like Trump is, Trump is going to have to respond to the markets. Again, the market, what we'll see is increasing volatility in the markets, and the longer the oil, is reduced for, the longer that's going to hit. I mean, I saw something I think today that said we're basically down to the last barrels of oil from the Gulf since the start of the conflict. So what happens at the end of April? Is there a sort of cliff edge? There seems to be a massive shift, and I'm no energy expert, but it seems that you listen to various podcasts, and some people say, "Oh, it's fine because there's 5 million barrels of oil going through the pipeline into the Red Sea, and there's bunker, and there's all these sort of." And some people are saying, no, there's a sort of COVID-like cliff edge coming. Suddenly nobody's going to be flying, and there's going to be rationing, and there's no middle ground, and I don't know where the truth is, because it feels like if the Iranians can hold out long enough for the sort of cliff edge moment, then again the American's going to have to back down, because ultimately, even though he's got oil resilience, the price at the pump is affected by the global market, not by the American market, and he's got an electorate to think of.
Yeah.
He's got cost of living to think of. Really, it's difficult to know how he isn't the one that blinks first. And then behind all this is China. Yeah, Trump is going to be meeting with China, with Xi in May, I think. He's not going to want this unresolved at that point. He's going to want something, some kind of a win out of this, by the time they meet. And do China put pressure on Iran, or does China start to pressure in other ways on the Americans? Yeah, some of these are just.
I can't see. I mean, if you're China now watching this, you're not doing anything, are you? You are just like, just let it play out. I mean, the longer it goes on, the more they benefit, or the more they, the stronger position they're in. Like, it just seems, because that was another question I was going to ask you. Is like, I asked you this last time, and I'm going to ask you it again. Like, who is this benefiting? Like, who does this benefit from a US from the US view? And I'm not asking, like I say, I'm not asking. You can't rationalize the irrational, so I'm not. But like, I can't see a world in which this benefits the US really, unless the Iranians do blink first, which is speculation. Like, who's this benefit? Or the only people I can see this benefiting are China, Russia, and Israel.
Does it? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You kind of bring. It's certainly. I mean, we can say who it isn't benefiting. It isn't benefiting Lebanon.
Mm,
It's not benefiting the
one,
Iranians, as in the population. What do they say? Sort of like 90% of them are moderate Iranians, and there's a sort of 10% IRGC hardcore. So 90% of the Iranian population are not benefiting now. I think again, this is this sort of play to resolve Iran in some way, to resolve it once and for all, to see, this sort of idealistic view of a regime change. And there are those who sort of said that that was naive and that it was sort of sold to him by the Israelis. But I can't believe for a moment the Israelis don't know the culture. They'll.
well, no, yeah.
So, who wins? I think you're right. I think China can sit off and observe, and they can play the long game. It's interesting. Of course, we learn during these kind of conflicts things like, what resilience really means. How long each nation across the world survived without oil. How many months of stock of oil do they have? And you kind of look at the UK somewhere down at 1 point something months of reserves. And then you look at, I don't know, Japan, and China right up there, consider this to be absolutely critical, and therefore they've got, resilience. So China can sit back and watch this. They can watch the Americans expend effort. I mean, to a certain extent, you could see the sort of China-Taiwan thing just resolving in a completely different way, where ultimately you could end up as the Taiwanese kind of looking and going, how does this not end up with the long game of China?
Yeah.
Because if you look at the Americans, do you even want that as a partner there? It's really challenging some of the assumptions that we've had about. But I can't see how America wins now. It doesn't feel like, it's the classic, nobody wins out of war, but China, Russia will try as best they can, but then, if you're tracking what the Ukrainians have done up in the Baltic, the Ukrainians are having a much better year than they've had previously. Let's not think that Russia.
For people, no, quickly though, just to explain to people who might not know what you're referencing there with the Ukrainians in the Baltic, can you just give a brief, a brief explain on that?
Yeah, over the past, and I won't attempt to mangle the names of the oil infrastructure, but what we've seen is over the last, I think it's about sort of 2 to 3 weeks now, a series of strikes, I mean, audacious strikes by the Ukrainians on critical oil infrastructure that both refines and is the sort of offloading point up sort of near St. Petersburg, up sort of just to the east of Finland. And they did a wave of attacks of drones and sort of domestically produced missiles over a sort of period of nights, repeated attacks on that infrastructure. Now, the Russians will probably, won't have completely decimated it and they'll recover quickly. But that's something like a quarter of Russia's oil exports go out from the areas that they attacked. That happened at exactly the time that America were sort of starting to lift sanctions on Russia. And so the Ukrainians will be looking at the Russian, economic situation and thinking, well, okay, what can we do to disrupt this? And sure enough, they're striking in the Baltic. I mean, it's incredible how that conflict has sort of just, the dynamics there. You and I sort of talked about this after the last session about how, the character of war, nature of war doesn't. You'll hear sort of pseudo academic military kind of characters like myself will talk about the nature and character of conflict, and this is sort of the two. You imagine nature lasts a very long time. That's the way I always think of it. Nature is it's always bloody, it's expensive, it's unpredictable, it's loss of life, it's it's devastating, or confusion and fog of war and all the rest of it. So that's the nature. The character of war is the sort of how wars are fought. So, from the breech loading rifle to the machine gun to the tank to armor to to where we are. And I think what we've seen over from the sort of the start of the conflict in Ukraine all the way through to, we're seeing a whole kind of range of military activity that we almost couldn't have imagined, and it seems to have become commonplace. So the Ukrainians striking oil facilities in Russia in the Baltic. I mean, just think about the geography of that and the technical ability to be able to do that. The Iranians now firing missiles across, and blockading the Straits of Hormuz. It feels like there are a whole sort of series of conflicts where we've sort of taken the lid off the can of worms, and how do you put that back in? How do you de-escalate across a sort of European concept of war now on the Ukraine, Russia? And now in the Middle East, we're seeing these sort of new, hundreds of drones being fired on a daily basis. Gaza and Lebanon and the Israeli action there, this sort of a level of violence and destruction that is we just couldn't have imagined that would be the norm prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a very short space of time.
Just because you mentioned Lebanon there, like one of the big things that sort of came out of the negotiations with Pakistan was the back and forth about whether a ceasefire in Lebanon was on the table or not. What do you make of that? Well, I mean, and how does that feed into this?
I mean, it certainly feeds into it in terms of Iran's long support. I mean, it's almost a sort of reverse relationship here, where Iran has supported Hezbollah in order to act as the thorn in the side of, I mean, that's underestimated, act as a weapon to kill and threaten Israel. I mean, to live under that is, and I think, we don't really understand what it is like to be Israeli and to live under that threat, especially for those who are in the northern part of the country. So it's appalling to live under that threat. And so you can see why Iran would want to see the two connected. And of course, the UK are saying that it should all form part of the peacekeeping deal. I'm not sure. I mean, I think what's happening is absolutely appalling. It's abhorrent what's happening to the people of Lebanon. And so I would like to see that violence stop. But I can see that those are two different conflicts. And yes, the protagonists are the same, but it is sort of slightly unusual to see the two connected in the same manner. It's all that. I think that is almost abnormal as opposed to normal. So I can see why the Iranians would want it in there. That the Pakistani sort of negotiators had agreed to put it in there, and that there's a disparities. I don't know what's behind that. Pakistanis, I guess, sympathy for the situation or desire to see it knitted together, but I think they are distinct, and I think they need to be dealt with separately. Partly because otherwise, if you include it, how do you resolve that? Because how do you pull the Israelis back from where they are now as well?
So to wrap it up, I've got one question. I mean, well, it's two questions inevitably, because whenever I say I've got one question, it's two. But how do you think this blockade changes the situation, and where's next? What happens next? Like, I'm not asking you to sort of determine how it ends, but like, once this, the blockade, like I say, how does it change it? But then where do they go from here if this doesn't work?
Do you know, it's a really good question, and I'll be really honest. Since this sort of blockade was thrown out there by the president on Truth Social, it's the thing that has, I guess, challenged me. And actually, I work with the Fozzie Miller Group, which is a predominantly US group of US retired naval, US Marine Corps officers. And so we agree, we share information, we understand, we try and do some analysis so that we understand. I think all of us have been challenged in trying to understand what this means and what it could lead to. And I'd sort of chicken out from the question to a certain extent to say we need to see 24, 48 hours longer, maybe even a week of this blockade to see how do the Americans intend to apply it. I think my problem with it is it doesn't break the toll booth concept. The maximalist approach by President Trump was completely illegal. But at the moment, it looks to me by the wording of what CENTCOM pushed out that you could, that the Chinese could put a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, so these huge ships, or liquid natural gas ships from Qatar, and they could sail through the Strait of Hormuz from Qatar, from one of the from Saudi oil terminal, whatever. They could go out via the toll route. They could pay their 2 million yuan to the IRGC, and they can leave and go to Asia. And so you sort of, you haven't stopped Iran controlling the strait. There is also an income from this sort of toll booth. So there's a trickle of money coming in. And so that you haven't blockaded their control. You haven't broken their control over the strait. And what I don't know is I don't know how long they can last if you can properly choke the finance from them selling oil to whoever the Iranians are selling oil to, the Chinese or Indians or whoever it is. I don't know who their main market is. As in, I'm fairly sure I do, but that's not my area of expertise.
No, it's
And so
speculations.
it's really difficult to know what's going to happen next. I think what I hope is it forces everyone back to the negotiating table. The Iranians were, I guess, understanding that this was never going to be, it was never going to be done in 21 hours. So these negotiations will take a long time. And I think as long as we see the ceasefire, holding, then there's reason for hope, and that they continue to talk. And maybe choking off the Iranian oil supply, and especially if you can see the markets stabilize because oil starts flowing, you get the merchant traffic building a bit of confidence. Then maybe there's an end game. I think what I would finish on is put yourself in the place of whether it's the operator or the owner, but think about the captain and the crew of one of these ships that's been stuck in the Gulf now for weeks. You've now either got to go via the Iranian toll booth and not really know what's going to meet you on the other end, or you go via the strait where the Iranians are threatening to fire on you if you don't follow the toll booth route, or there are mines. And put yourself in their position, because actually the people who are losing out as part of this as well, and I think we said this last time, is the merchant community who are stuck without a proper voice in this. And to a certain extent, it will be their actions that will decide the future, because they will go where they are confident. And if the Iranians are confidently demonstrating that you can go through this toll booth via Larak Island and you can get out the other side and the Americans aren't going to board you, then that's what they will start doing. And that will create a really dangerous precedent, because that will start to establish the Iranians as the sort of de facto controllers of the strait. And if you don't get to the end state of freedom of movement in the Straits of Hormuz, that ripples out to every similar waterway around the world, and other nations will seek to take advantage of that at some point in the future. And that's really dangerous. But yeah, the merchant community are stuck between a rock and a hard place. It must be miserable for them, and their operators must be going out their minds trying to work this out, because every time you think you see a chink or like a ray of hope, something comes along and there's volatility again, and really difficult.
We'll wrap up there, but like you said, we're going to need a week or two to figure out or to see how this plays out. So I'm sure I'll speak to you in a week or two.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Cheers, mate. Good to speak again.
If you enjoyed this interview, head to our website, readthebeacon.org. That's readthebeacon.org, and like and follow us on YouTube and Substack.